In less than a year, more than 100,000 jobs in the U.S. have disappeared, not because of automation or competition from China, but because of a decision made in Washington, a 50% tariff on imported aluminum. A policy once praised as a shield to protect American workers has now become a double-edged sword, severing supply chains, forcing factories to shut down, and pushing workers out the door. Meanwhile, Canada, the country hit with the tariff, has quietly benefited, expanding production and emerging as a new global supply hub. What is truly happening behind the curtain of industrial protection? And could this be the early sign of an economic crisis taking root within America? The illusion of a shield and the reality of the storm. When a policy is drawn with slogans but executed with a lack of understanding of global value chains, the consequences are not just red numbers on job reports. They are silent towns, shuttered factories, and industrial dreams pushed into the past. What's happening to the American aluminum industry is the clearest proof. We are witnessing a bitter paradox. A tariff issued to protect American workers has instead stripped away job opportunities for hundreds of thousands of people. A 50% import tax on aluminum, a number that sounds bold and decisive, turns out to be an empty shield, lacking any domestic investment plan, no matching energy policy, and, above all, no engagement with those on the front lines: workers, engineers, and small manufacturing businesses. At a press conference in Pennsylvania, the president confidently declared that America would bring aluminum jobs back stronger than ever. The statement received applause, but just a few months later, 74 workers at an aluminum smelter in Kentucky received layoff notices. No banners, no farewells, just a cold white piece of paper. One worker, who had been there for over 23 years, shared, "I never thought a policy called Protecting America would cost me my job." In his eyes, there was no anger, only confusion, a struggle to understand how everything collapsed so quickly. Because, in reality, a high tariff cannot create jobs if domestic manufacturing is not competitive. And aluminum is one of the most infrastructure-intensive sectors. Producing aluminum is not like sewing t-shirts or hammering wood. It is an energy-guzzling operation, demanding a stable, cheap, and continuous power supply. But in the U.S., industrial electricity is not cheap. Indeed, in many industrial states like Indiana or Ohio, it's more than twice the price compared to Quebec, Canada. Meanwhile, Canada, with abundant hydroelectricity and smart production support policies, maintains significantly lower operating costs. So, no matter how high the tariff wall is built, America's internal capacity cannot withstand its own weight. Domestic plants cannot suddenly spring back without affordable electricity, investment in smelting facilities, or a long-term industrial strategy. That is why even major corporations like Alcoa, a symbol of the U.S. aluminum industry, refuse to commit to reopening plants based solely on political promises. Their CEO bluntly stated, "You can't restart an aluminum smelter with just words. We need cheap, stable electricity and a real commitment." So what's really happening? When importing companies are forced to pay hundreds of millions of extra dollars each quarter due to high tariffs, they have no choice but to cut capacity, raise prices, or worse, move production overseas. And when factories downsize, the entire surrounding ecosystem collapses. Transportation firms, logistics, packaging, and parts suppliers. That's why the 100,000 lost jobs aren't just cold statistics. They are fractures running through an already fragile economic network, still recovering from the pandemic. What's more troubling is that this policy didn't arise in a vacuum. It is part of a broader wave of economic protectionism that has surged in the U.S. over the past half-decade, a reaction driven by emotion toward globalization but never fully thought through. And now, as reality strikes back, those suffering first are not the policymakers, but the blue-collar workers in grease-stained uniforms, standing in silent smelters, asking themselves, have we been left behind? Again? A policy isn't wrong when it comes from good intentions. But if it's not accompanied by real investment, long-term vision, and practical dialogue with businesses, it becomes a hollow shell. Like an umbrella opened in the middle of a storm with no bricks beneath it for shelter. And eventually, people will realize that shield was never meant to protect. It was just there to hide the helplessness in the face of a far more complex reality than any slogan can solve. The energy wall. If tariffs are the wall built to block imported goods, then electricity costs are the invisible wall that blocks from within, preventing America itself from restarting its industrial engine. In the story of the aluminum industry, people often talk about trade protection, about preserving domestic market share. But few dare to look straight at the deeper cause. America is no longer cheap to produce in, and here, energy is the fatal weakness. There is an overlooked truth when it comes to rebuilding the American aluminum industry. Producing 1 ton of aluminum consumes enough electricity to power a household for half a year. Aluminum is not something you can smelt in just any factory, anywhere. It requires a power source that is stable, continuous, and, above all, cheap. But in the United States of 2025, that is becoming increasingly rare. In industrial states like Pennsylvania, Ohio, or Indiana, once the heart of America's Rust Belt, industrial electricity costs range from 8 to over 11 cents per kilowatt-hour. Meanwhile, across the northern border, Quebec pays only about 4.5 cents per kilowatt-hour, thanks to its developed hydroelectric system and rational energy planning. That gap, seemingly small per kilowatt, on the scale of millions of tons of aluminum per year, becomes a chasm too wide to bridge with political slogans or tariff promises. A technical director at an aluminum smelter in Ohio said during a closed hearing, "I can survive high tariffs, but I can't beat high electricity costs. They kill my plant every minute." In past years, when politicians talked about bringing jobs back, they didn't factor in one key thing. America's energy infrastructure has become the biggest barrier to its own industrial recovery. Over the past 2 decades, the U.S. has heavily invested in renewable energy, but has lacked targeted planning for heavy industry. Solar and wind power, though environmentally friendly, cannot provide the stable, continuous, high-capacity supply required by metallurgy. Meanwhile, traditional power plants, coal, natural gas, have been restricted by environmental regulations, causing prices to rise while output remains unchanged. The result? America's aluminum industry is caught in an energy trap, unable to expand, unable to compete, and unable to survive on temporary subsidies. In contrast, Canada makes few declarations but has long had deep strategic planning. Quebec not only has abundant hydropower, accounting for over 95% of the province's electricity output, but also has special policies designed specifically for metallurgy and heavy industry. They sign long-term power contracts with aluminum smelters, fixing prices for 10 to 20 years, ensuring that no market fluctuation can disrupt production. And most importantly, they do it without tariffs, without trade wars, without beating drums or making noise. While Washington holds press conferences, Ottawa holds closed-door meetings with businesses. When the White House announces higher tariffs, the Canadian government quietly expands power grid infrastructure, provides green credit lines for smelting plants, and commits to cutting carbon taxes for aluminum that meets low-emission standards. They don't loudly proclaim job protection. They create the conditions for jobs to grow on their own. That's the difference between two mindsets. One builds barriers and hopes things change inside. The other builds foundations so that change happens from within. And then, while Americans watch plants shut down because they can't handle electricity costs, Canadians expand production lines, add night shifts, and gear up for orders from Europe and Asia. Markets now hesitant to trade with the U.S. due to policy instability. No one shouts. Only the power stations by the Saguenay River remain lit through the night, where aluminum is smelted with water power, not with politics. The biggest question now isn't whether America can revive its aluminum industry. It's this: if the root problem of energy cost isn't addressed, which industry will be the next victim? Steel, automobiles, or the entire production chain of the American economy? Because in the modern industrial world, no sector can stand without energy that is stable, cheap, and smart. And no protectionist policy can replace that fundamental truth. Aluminum is just the opening chapter. But if America doesn't confront its own energy wall, then what's being lost won't just be jobs. It will be the core manufacturing capability of a superpower. When silence becomes strategy. There were no angry declarations, no protest tweets, no press conferences declaring retaliation. When the U.S. imposed a 50% tariff on imported aluminum, a direct blow to its largest supplier, Canada chose silence. But it wasn't the silence of passivity. It was the silence of a carefully calculated move. While American media focused on banners reading "Bring Jobs Back" in Quebec, the aluminum capital of Canada, night shifts were added. Engineers were urgently recruited. Old smelting plants were surveyed for revival. Long-term contracts with Europe were being negotiated. No rebuttals, no counterattacks, but each step was a clear response to what was happening south of the border. Perhaps Canadians understand one thing. The market doesn't need debate. It needs data, and the numbers are speaking for them. In the first quarter of 2025, Canada's primary aluminum output rose by 12%, mainly to fill the gap left by American importers. As component manufacturers in Germany, South Korea, Japan were forced to pivot their supply sources, they turned to a place with stable electricity prices, consistent policies, and free from geopolitical turbulence. That place was Canada. To many Americans, especially workers in the metallurgy industry, this is almost unbelievable. They once thought the tariff would make Canada stagger, close factories en masse, break supply chains. But what they witnessed were convoys leaving Saguenay daily, hauling aluminum to eastern ports for export. A Canadian supervisor shared in a small interview, "We're not racing against the U.S., we're just doing our part right." That doing our part is the foundation of Canada's quiet success. Strategic thinking instead of political reaction. When the U.S. built barriers, Canada didn't respond with more barriers, but with long-term preparation. Even before the 50% tariff was issued, provincial governments had expanded energy incentive programs, invested in logistics infrastructure for metallurgy, and, most importantly, established strong trade relationships with non-U.S. partners. That effort wasn't just economic, it sent a powerful signal. Canada had no intention of becoming a victim in the U.S.'s trade power game. They intended to become the reliable alternative. And strangely, it was this restraint that drew global attention. In Geneva, Canada's representatives filed documents with the WTO, not demanding that the U.S. revoke the tariff immediately, but challenging the legality of imposing tariffs on a partner that had signed the USMCA, a trade agreement seen as a new symbol of North American cooperation. No TV interviews, no fiery rhetoric. Canada let international trade law do the talking. At the same time, Ottawa pushed forward new trade negotiations with the EU, Japan, India, and ASEAN, not just to find new markets for aluminum, but to gradually reduce reliance on the U.S. "We don't want a hasty breakup, But if the neighbor shuts the door, we have to find another way," a senior Canadian industry official shared in a closed meeting. And they succeeded. While the U.S. cut orders, Europe increased purchases. As U.S. firms reduced production due to high raw material costs, manufacturers in Mexico, South Korea, and India turned to Canadian suppliers. Not only did Canada retain its market share, it began rising as a global hub for clean aluminum, powered by hydropower, policy stability, and its refusal to wage trade wars. There's an ironic twist unfolding. The America First policy inadvertently created a Canada-preferred outcome. International investors didn't pull out of North America, they just pulled out of the southern part. And when global companies evaluate where to build factories, they consider not just tariffs, but policy stability, predictability, and transparency. Qualities Canada has in abundance, and which the U.S. is gradually losing. In that picture, Canada's silence is not weakness. It is the strength of quiet confidence. And when a nation is calm enough not to shout, but still makes the world take notice, that's when it's truly leading, even if it's not standing on the podium. Because in long-term strategy, it's not the loudest who wins, it's the one who prepares the best. And by now, perhaps many Americans are beginning to admit something they never expected. Canada's rise didn't come from confrontation, but from wise choices, layoff letters, and shattered dreams. In a small town in western Kentucky, where locals once proudly called it America's Aluminum Valley, the sound of smelters has now completely fallen silent. The gas station by the road closes at 6 p.m. The bakery stops production as customer volume is cut in half. Even the public library has to reduce its hours because there's no longer enough budget to pay the librarian's salary. It all began with something that seemed distant, a tax policy signed in Washington. But the outcome lies in every meal, every bill, every tired gaze of those who lost their jobs without understanding why. An economic policy, when not designed from real-life experience, creates ripple shocks like dominoes, not only on the stock exchange, but right in the streets still struggling to recover after the pandemic. And the 50% tariff on imported aluminum has done exactly that. People often picture industry as a sturdy block of steel. Machines, production lines, factories. But real industry is built by people. Workers directly operating the smelters, technicians monitoring temperatures, drivers transporting raw materials, maintenance staff, loaders, accountants, and dozens of indirect jobs surrounding a single plant. When one link is removed, the entire employment ecosystem can collapse. A report from Alcoa shows 20,000 direct jobs and 80,000 indirect jobs were affected just months after the tariff was implemented. But what lies behind that number? It's Mr. John, a 57-year-old worker who lost his job after 29 years at an aluminum plant in Indiana. It's Ms. Mary, the owner of a small diner that thrived thanks to factory workers. It's Tom, a senior mechanical engineering student who no longer has a place to intern because the factory shut down. For these workers, a job is not just a source of income, it's the thread that holds family life together. A man losing his job while his wife undergoes diabetes treatment doesn't just lose a paycheck. He loses his health insurance. A woman laid off from a maintenance job doesn't just lose rent money. She postpones her child's plans for college. Why don't these stories appear in government reports? Because they're not in the budget spreadsheets. But they exist clearly in the worried looks of the elderly delaying retirement, in the size of families tightening spending, and in the heavy silence blanketing once bustling industrial towns. The people once believed. They believed that protectionist policies would bring jobs back, believed the government was thinking of them, believed that things would get better. But now they see the reality. The factories don't reopen, prices still rise, and jobs don't return. They don't need another speech. They need action. They don't need someone to criticize past policies. They need someone to fix them before it's too late. That disappointment doesn't explode, but it sinks deep. It spreads into political trust, into how people perceive their government, and into the future they once hoped to build with their own hands. Because when a policy is issued without listening to the voices of those it affects, the consequence isn't just economic, it's societal fracture. The American industrial dream may not be dead, but it's gathering dust, under layoff letters with no explanation, behind shuttered shops with no date to reopen, and within people who once believed but now no longer dare to. From aluminum prices to the dinner table. When people talk about aluminum, the image that usually comes to mind is soda cans, windows, or heavy industrial materials. But behind a single sheet of aluminum lies an entire supply chain. And when that chain fractures due to tariff policy, the impact doesn't stop at the factory. It spreads to every household, every kitchen, every minor purchasing decision. Since the 50% tariff was imposed on imported aluminum, aluminum prices have surged by 40 to 60%, and that shock has rippled outward like endless waves. Not only have smelters suffered, but also car manufacturers, home appliance producers, food packaging companies, and countless industries that rely on aluminum as an essential structural component. A pickup truck like the 2025 Ford F-150, manufactured in the U.S., has increased in price by over $3,000 compared to the 2024 model. Not because of better technology, but because raw material costs, especially aluminum, have risen too quickly. And when consumers see car prices rise, they don't just hesitate to buy new vehicles, they also cut back on other expenses. Refrigerators, washing machines, air conditioners, electric stoves, even rice cookers. At a home appliance manufacturing plant in Arkansas, the production director had to cut 40% of the budget-friendly product line because aluminum casing costs pushed retail prices above the psychological threshold of $500, a crucial mark for middle-income consumers. We can't sell affordable refrigerators with current aluminum costs. If we try to keep prices down, we'll have to sacrifice quality. And that would destroy customer trust, he said. Choices are slowly disappearing. Consumers no longer have many models to choose from. But prices continue to creep up, little by little. A can of soda increases by 10 cents, a carton of milk rises by 15 cents due to packaging costs, and an oven becomes $80 more expensive in just 6 months. No one feels poorer because a can of soda costs a few cents more. But when that happens across hundreds of products, every week, every month, purchasing power declines, and a vicious cycle begins to form. In a Nielsen survey in the second quarter of 2025, 58% of American consumers over age 50 said they had postponed or canceled plans to buy new home appliances. Half of them said they felt uneasy about the rising price trend and lacked confidence in the government's ability to control inflation. That feeling doesn't come from media hype, but from daily experiences in supermarkets, appliance stores, and ever-lengthening utility bills. Worse still, small businesses have almost no room to maneuver. While large corporations can negotiate import prices or shift their supply chains to Canada or Mexico to avoid tariffs, small workshops and domestic manufacturers don't have the resources to do that. A cabinet manufacturer in Michigan had to lay off nearly half its workforce and shut down 2 production lines because it couldn't compete with imported products that enjoy favorable treatment outside tariff zones. From the beginning of 2025 through June, nearly 5,700 small and medium-sized businesses in the light metal sector have closed or suspended operations, according to a report from the U.S. Small Business Administration, SBA. Each business is a small community, and when those doors close, it takes away not just jobs, but also local tax revenue, regional consumption, and the momentum to recover after the pandemic. The aluminum tariff policy was designed with a big goal: to protect the domestic smelting industry, but in reality, it's leaving behind very small but very real scratches in every corner of the economy. From the price of a soda can, to the decision to buy a new car, to the closure of a refrigerator factory. And when consumers become hesitant, when spending tightens, the economic cycle slows down, no matter how much the government wants to boost production. The question is no longer, does the policy help the aluminum industry? But, is the price being paid, from cars to the dinner table, worth it? And if it's not, who will have the courage to make a change? A lesson from a roofless shield. When a nation tries to shield its industry with tariffs, but allows its infrastructure, technology, and energy systems to lag behind, what happens is not a revival, but a long, helpless slide. And the irony is that those who bear the brunt first are not the politicians who make the policy, but the workers, small businesses, and families struggling with rising prices and vanishing jobs. Today's aluminum crisis is not the first. It echoes what happened in 2002 when the U.S. government decided to impose tariffs ranging from 8% to 30% on imported steel, promising to save the domestic steel industry and preserve American jobs. But after just 18 months, a report from the Peterson Institute for International Economics revealed a number that shocked all of Washington. 200,000 jobs had disappeared, mostly in steel-consuming sectors, such as auto manufacturing, construction, machinery, and industrial equipment. More frighteningly, that statistic revealed a harsh truth. For every steel job saved, as many as 8 other jobs were lost. And now, more than 20 years later, that same mistake is repeating itself, this time with aluminum. The lesson from 2002 is painfully clear. Tariffs may be an umbrella, but if there's no roof beneath, no cheap energy, no new technology, no trained workforce, then the umbrella will only provide momentary shade before the storm hits. America's problem doesn't lie in a lack of decisiveness. It lies in the fact that big policies are made without foundational support. In the case of aluminum, that foundation includes a stable electricity system, clean metallurgy technology, preferential loans for business reinvestment, and a clear strategy to reopen old plants with higher efficiency. But none of those things were deployed in sync when the 50% tariff was imposed. People waited for a miracle from the market, from the belief in American inner strength, but forgot that strength must be nourished by reality, not just sustained by slogans applauded at campaign rallies. Meanwhile, competitors like Canada, Norway, and Australia have been years ahead in integrating clean energy into metallurgy, using efficient emission control systems, and receiving international environmental recognition as top sustainable aluminum producers. That kind of investment is the real shield, not only protecting jobs, but also creating long-term competitiveness without the need for temporary tariffs. And if the current policy continues without addressing the root issues, the next industry to fall might not be aluminum. Automobiles, aviation, even food, industries that rely heavily on light metal supply chains, are already feeling the tremors of a deeper underground quake. An industry never stands alone. When one link breaks, the entire production chain wobbles. The question we must ask now is not, how do we save the aluminum industry? But, how do we ensure America truly has competitive strength in the 21st century? Not with barriers, but with internal capacity. Not with emergency fixes, but with long-term strategy. Because if all we do is build tariff walls without rebuilding the industrial foundation from within, America won't step into the future. It will just revisit old mistakes under a new name. We cannot protect one industry by allowing others to collapse, and we certainly cannot call it a workers' policy when workers are the first to lose their jobs. Protection without restructuring is nothing more than a delay, not of collapse, but of responsibility, a necessary turn. Before it's too late. When a policy is enacted, what matters is not only its goal, but the ability to adjust when reality shows it's causing harm. With the 50% tariff on imported aluminum, the United States is no longer at a crossroads. It is barreling down a slope where jobs keep disappearing, prices keep rising, and industrial dominance is gradually yielding to competitors who know how to move slowly but surely. The question now is no longer, who's right, who's wrong, but do we have the courage to reflect and change in time? Because the signs are too clear: broken supply chains, small businesses collapsing, workers losing jobs, market confidence shaking, and above all, the world is quietly stepping away from America's role as an industrial center. Not because they hate the U.S., but because they can't wait any longer. Experts have offered various solutions, and each comes with either an opportunity or a price to pay. The first option is to flexibly adjust the tariff rate, instead of a blanket 50% for all as currently implemented. For example, exempt or reduce tariffs for strategic partners like Canada, where environmental standards are high, supply chains are stable, and they are part of the USMCA agreement. Or apply a lower rate for recycled aluminum or aluminum from clean sources to encourage global green trends. According to estimates from the Tax Reform Institute, just reducing the tariff from 50% to 20% for Canadian aluminum could save U.S. businesses up to $3.2 billion per year in raw material costs. This approach not only maintains the objective of competing with cheap goods from China, but also preserves relationships with longtime partners, protects domestic businesses and workers. More importantly, it shows that America is not rigid, but capable of learning and adapting, something every modern economy must do. The second option is to keep the tariff as it is, hoping that enough pressure will eventually force domestic plants to restart, rehire, and ramp up production to reclaim lost market share. But, as already analyzed, this is like waiting for a seed to sprout on barren soil. Without cheap electricity, without technological investment, without financial support, no plant can survive, let alone grow. This is a plan based on hope, not reality. The third option, and the one few dare to discuss publicly, is to completely lift the tariff and return to the free trade model from before 2018. But this carries massive political risk, because if the U.S. removes the tariffs without a clear industrial revitalization plan, the remaining metallurgy industry could fall into deep shock, and belief in the slogan "Protect America" might shatter. However, among those three options, what the government cannot continue to do is nothing. Because if silence is a successful strategy for Canada, then America's silence now is a sign of deadlock. And in economics, prolonged deadlock not only costs money, it costs trust, markets, and the global leadership status the U.S. has built for over a century. Experts at the Institute for International Economics have warned, if the aluminum tariff policy is not adjusted within the next 12 months, the manufacturing sector's GDP could drop another 0.4%, and job losses could exceed 150,000. These numbers are no longer just warnings. They are real. On every empty payroll, every shuttered factory, every worker leaving the plant with a cardboard box holding 30 years of their life. And if America truly wants to come back stronger, the first thing to do isn't to shout louder, but to know when to stop, listen, and adjust. Because history does not grant second chances to nations too proud to admit they were wrong. But history always honors those that dare to turn back before it's too late.